Hello, this is Xycerian here. We're just going over another set of my notes. This time for Wasp, who has just been released. I actually got the pack yesterday, although I'm on leave, so I've played a decent chunk of it in the last day or so. But it doesn't really matter when it comes to these analyses. These are more on paper. Quite literally in the form of the screen at the moment, but yeah, we'll get right into this. Assumptions are the same as they have been forever. Haven't changed any of these. Haven't felt any need to change any of these. They just, most cards that come out seem to reinforce that these are the balance points, with, you know, more situational cards being above these because they're more situational. So I'm pretty happy with these values still, so we're just going to keep using them. So let's get straight into this with the identity, which of course is Wasp, which is one of these double hero formed ones, similar to Ant-Man. The difference though is pretty major. There's a very big difference between Wasp and Ant-Man in how they play. So anyway, what do we have here? We have a stat line that is basically one less in tiny form across all stats. It's one better in Wasp form, 2 fraughts is roughly equivalent to the 3 defend. That's probably their best stat, but the 1 fraught is not as good as the 2 defense, although none of these stats are really all that great. So then we just have the abilities, and the free recover on the alter ego is the worst that we have. Like we go 3 to 5 currently on recover, and she's at the low end of that. So we've got here the giant form lets you split your attack or your damage or frauding across multiple minions or sides or schemes, depending on whether you're attacking or frauding. That's good if you have side schemes or minions. If you don't have any minions or side schemes, then that doesn't really do anything, which is a bit of a problem. But it does mean that you should always get full value from whatever stats you have. In giant form, at least. In tiny form, your ability is after Wasp defeats or an event that you play, defeats a minion or side scheme, deal 1 damage to the villain. So things to note here. Defeats a minion or side scheme. That's gonna mess up. Yeah, so you got to defeat something, and then you deal 1 damage to the villain. It's specifically the villain, not to a minion or an enemy or anything like that. It's specifically the villain. Yeah, it's entirely reliant on side schemes or minions. There's probably one of those in play, but there won't necessarily be one of those in play every turn, meaning that your hero ability, which your stat line's alright, but not insane, at least not at the start. It gets pretty good later on. But your abilities in hero form are all reliant on side schemes and minions. And that can be a problem if there's no side schemes or minions. If you don't have any side schemes or minions, your hero abilities are doing nothing. Just pulling none of the weight there. And they're also they're not completely reliant on you actually exhausting, but they're pretty reliant on you exhausting to trigger these. It can be a bit of a problem. Yeah, it's been a bit of a problem for me in the games I've been playing. However, I want to go into the alter ego here as well. It is really strong. It's one of the strongest forms of recursion we have in the game. It allows you to stack high value cards multiple times. So, for example, Rapid Response, which is by this point I think most people realize that's a very strong leadership card. Instead of getting 3 copies of it per deck cycle, you now can get 5 or 7 or however many you want, because you can keep putting them back in. Like, there is a limit, obviously. Like, you're gonna run out of time to go back to Alter Ego to shuffle them back in after a while, and the variants in the draw and whatnot. But this is just a very, very strong ability. I think out of all of these identity abilities, this is probably the best of them, and it's probably the one, grand scheme of things, it's probably the one I would build around the most when building a Wasp deck. Other things of note: hand size 6'5", that's standard, 11 HP. It's not super low, but it's not super high either. It's kind of like the midpoint. It's alright. We'll just go on to the set of cards, see what else we've got here. First card we're talking about, Ant-Man, Scott Lang, which is good because it means that you can still run Ant-Man Hank Pym, the leadership ally that was added in the Ant-Man pack. Now, this one is the first ally that we have that has one consequential damage on fraught and can get to 3 fraught natively. That's a very big deal because that's generally where you get your most value, because it's generally harder to fraught than it is to deal damage, and most allies have balanced or relatively balanced stats. Like a 2 fraught free attack is about the same value, but in this case we have a 3 fraught or free attack, depending on what form we're in, and it's pretty good. The 3 fraught is very good. In fact, you get 6 threat off the table, and then you get to sacrifice it as a chump block. That's pretty good. 5 costs though is on the high end, but it definitely adds up. I've got the +4 value per deck cycle. That's pretty good. Like, if I remember correctly, Nick Fury is around what is it, 6.3, 8.3, -5, 3.3. I would value, yeah, Nick Fury is around the 3.3, and Nick Fury is a really good ally. So, yeah, obviously if Ant-Man is in play, you won't be able to use this, so at least it's got a wild icon in that case, but not really a big deal unless you're specifically building a deck around this, which I think the only way to do would be as a Voltron target, because it is a good Voltron target because of its high base stats. And yeah, obviously only 1 copy, but it's a good ally. It's a little expensive. It's on the expensive end. It's the only problem here, and I think that it's a trend with Nadia's cards, just in general. So let's go on to the next one. Giant Help. Giant Help, events, 2 costs, removes 3 or 4 threats. It's basically only worth using in Giant form because it just gets stronger, it gets strictly better. But if you only need to remove 3 threat, there's no reason to swap to Giant form if you don't need the extra one. It can run into some awkward shenanigans with crisis icons because it doesn't allow you to ignore them. So if there's a crisis icon, you can't thwart from the main scheme because you select it all at once. It's kind of similar to the situation you get with Guard. Guard and Shield Throw in Captain America, where you have to select all your targets, so you can't select the villain because the Guard's in play. It's pretty good. Like, the anything that gets you 4 threat for printed costs of 2, total costs of 3, that's always going to be pretty good. Like, that's 4 justice, but you don't have to be in justice. It's like just 2 copies of 4 justice that fit in your aggression deck. Like, I'm not going to complain about that. Yeah, it's alright. Pretty good. Kind of, the fact that they think that this is strong enough to be a hero card kind of shows how strong 4 justice is, but that's topic for another day at the moment. Pinpoint Strike. I think this might actually be her best card. It's definitely the best 8 damage overkill card we have. But anyway, yeah, 3 printed cost for total as can do either 8 damage with overkill or 7 damage without. Similar to Giant Help, it's always better in one form, in this case Tiny, because it's always going to do 1 more damage, and the overkill means that it can actually put some damage onto the villain, meaning that no damage is ever wasted. Pretty good. These have both been mental resources, so they're both targets for getting shuffled back in with the girl action on the alter ego. I rate this value at about 1.33 higher than the cost. So and this one's at 1, so like they're both pretty good. Like, they're gonna increase the efficiency of your the value of your remaining deck cycle pretty significantly, and yeah, they're just I think they're both pretty good, but you'll notice that we're on the expensive end so far. Like 1 4 cost, 2 2 costs, 3 3 costs. Like, these aren't cheap, which is something that it keeps coming up here. Rapid growth. This is the first one that's cheap. It's also the first one that's like almost impossible to evaluate properly, because like to start with, why didn't you just flip to hero form, to giant hero form, which has higher stats? Why? How much does the +2 add versus what you're spending on it? Like, a +2 attack in aggression, and I feel like aspect cards and hero cards should like aspect cards that are in the that are strengths of that aspect, and hero cards should probably at least be comparable most of the time. You end up with this situation, like this same effect, except for the flipping to giant form, would cost you 0 in aggression. Whereas here, it's a bit different because it's all 3 of them, but it costs you 2. No, not 2, 1. For a total value of 2. So you really need to take into account the difference in your stats as well, which at the start of the game is 1, but you get some shenanigans lowering it down the line. So at the start of the game, this is probably always worth it if you've like flipped from alter ego into tiny form because you needed to do something in tiny. You've done what you needed to do in tiny, and now you're trying to just get maximum value out of your exhaust. This will be worth it. More worth it for fraught, but still worth it no matter what. But if you say have your helmet, then attacking's not worth it. If you have your synthetic wings, then defending's not worth it. Using this on defending's not worth it, unless you also have the red room training, so you can get the retaliate as well. Frauding is the one that's always worth it, but once again, why didn't you just flip to the giant form and then fraud? So the only reasons I can think of are you're in tiny form, you're in tiny form and you need to go to alter ego. You are in alter ego and you need to go through tiny form, or end in tiny form. Like, you need to go to all three forms this turn. It's considering the only alter ego action you have is the one on your alter ego ability, on your alter ego card, and you have nothing that really requires tiny form. Like, this is the closest we have to a tiny form card. I think this is actually a fairly situational card, and will not often get value, get additional value. It'll hit a good baseline. Like, playing this is always going to be at least on par with your other options, but it's not going to be a standout card that did so much more than what your other cards in hand could have done. It might do something different. Like, if you're playing Justice, you might be able to attack hard with this card, or prevent a ton of damage, which you wouldn't normally be able to do in Justice. But that's the strength of this card, is the versatility, not the innate effect here. Let's go over Wasp Sting quickly. It's another damage card. 2 copies, mental resource. It's a little bit above the value I would expect for a damage card. Like, 2 for 5 damage is pretty good. It's not like super high value wouldn't write home about it, really. Probably wouldn't even bother shuffling this one back in with the girl action, just because of the relatively low value per deck cycle here. Although, if there's nothing else, probably consider it. The giant form is only worth it the giant form version is only worth it if you are hitting at least 2 targets. You'd have to be hitting at least 2 targets with it. You'd have to... One of them would have to be 3 HP or less, because once again you're getting into this situation where, why didn't you just swap to tiny form and play this? And that comes up a lot with these cards, because, like, did you really need the 4th threat removal, or did you select it to do this in giant form because you needed the 4th threat removal, but then you weren't able to get to tiny to get the 5th damage? That's probably the situation you're in, really, that you would play this in giant form. It's just I feel like with Wasp in particular, you can control what form you're in a lot easier and play your cards in the correct form more often than not. Pin Particles. This is exactly the same as the Pin Particles in the Ant-Man deck. It's slightly better as a heal than it is as a draw, but it's also the only healing this character has, and there's some damage reduction, and the only resource generation in the whole deck. It's useful in both forms. Giant's technically slightly better, but you can lose value on it because you can be at full hit points, which is nowhere near as common in Wasp as it is in Ant-Man. Tiny form doesn't lose that much value. It still gets a pretty good draw. It's a wild resource. It's only 1 resource, so it's not actually, unlike the other resource cards, it's not helping you pay for the card that you're playing now, though it might help you play a second card that turn because of the draw in tiny. Also, probably shouldn't say hero response, because after you spend this means it should be in the discard pile, and the text isn't active in the discard pile on resource cards. But it's not a big deal. We know what this is intending to do, so you just do it. Now, we are up to the 3 upgrade cards in this pack that creates what she can do late game. So, first thing, Red Rune Training. I didn't put any values over here besides the cost, because it's really hard to evaluate these 2 particular abilities. Retaliate 1 in Giant, so every time you get hit, you in Giant you take they take a damage back. If they're not ranged, okay, cool. That can add up pretty quickly. It's pretty good for removing tough, but the tiny form here gives you piercing, which also allows you to remove tough. So turns out you're really good at removing tough. Retaliate at least has more value beyond that. It can do a 1 damage an attack per attack that you get sent into you. You have 3 defense as Giant, so with adding Retaliate 1 on top of that's pretty good. Like, there's only 1 other character that has Retaliate 1 and 3 defense as part of their hero set, and that's Captain America. Though, obviously with his shield, it's easier for him to set it up. And piercing can be nice. Like, tough icons come out from time to time, although it only gives it to the basic attacks, which I think is the most awkward thing about this, because it means that a lot of the time your hero ability in Tiny kind of stops you from using piercing. Like, for example, let's say there's a guard minion, right? You flip to Tiny form, you play a card, it kills the guard. It kills the guard. You now trigger your hero ability, which removes the tough, but it wasn't piercing because your hero ability isn't a basic attack, so you don't get the piercing on it. You also get things with overkill, like if it has overkill, you can't. If you play a card that has overkill to get through a guard minion, you can't use the piercing here because the overkill will trigger it. You could be exhausted. You may need to recover. You may need to thwart. Like, there's a few issues with the piercing side of this, but the retaliate side's pretty solid. And the combination of the two is probably worth the two value one here. Even if it's not quite as good as, say, Captain America's shield, but Captain America's shield's part of his whole set, and this will just sit in play forever and give you retaliate 1 forever. So all in all, it's a pretty good card, and like, if we compare it to the closest comparison we have for an aspect card would be electrostatic armor, and electrostatic armor isn't a retaliate, it's a when you defend, deal 1 damage to them, which is a harder condition to meet. So, and it only costs 1 less than this. Pretty comparable. I would take this over it if I could, but it's Wasp only, so I'll play it if it comes up. Biosynthetic Wings. I think this is a very good card. I think this is the best, maybe second best. The helmet's pretty good. We'll get to the helmet in a sec. It's a pretty simple effect. When you would take any amount of damage, you can, if you're in tiny form, you can exhaust the wings to prevent 1 of that damage. The important thing here is it doesn't say attack damage, and it's not a defense card, so it's not a defense ability, so it's just works. It just prevents 1 damage. Like, it doesn't matter. Is it indirect? Is it triggered based off an ability? It doesn't matter. So chances are in tiny form, you're going to take at least 1 damage. I don't see any way around it. Your defense is only 2. But this can effectively turn your defense into 3 because you can use it on that first attack every turn. It's pretty good. Aerial trait though, not as good. You really don't need the aerial trait. There's nothing in your hero set that requires it. The only card in the card pool that currently requires it is Get Over Here. You have nothing that requires you to engage minions, so it's just so that would just be a matter of pulling the damage off of someone else, and quite frankly, your 11 HP is not super tanky, particularly if they recover. Though I have had some fun with this because it can trigger off minion attacks. I can basically ignore a minion attack every turn while chump blocking. So you could argue that like you can pull some of those over to you and then use that. It's not the worst. It's multiplayer only though. Like that consideration would just not come up ever in solo. Let's get to the last card. Wasp Helmet. This I think is this is probably better than the wings. I know I went to say that they were the best before, but yeah. Giant form +1 fort. That's insane. That makes it a 3/2/3 form. It's the first native fort form that we have in the game. The +1 attack in tiny is pretty relevant too because of the piercing that you can get. This means that you can have a 2 attack piercing, which is where Black Knight is, but it's built into your hero set, so that could be useful alongside. I don't think there's anything with toughness and 2 HP, but there's it's pretty useful alongside things like skilled strike or combat training, where you can start getting to the 3, 4s, and 5s, where toughness normally exists. Although I think there's a 6 in the Arachnauts modular set, but still. You've got on-demand piercing in tiny form, so this is pretty good for that. Does make attacking basically the tiny form's best stat, which is good because it means that you can trigger your tiny form, the small but mighty, more often on killing minions with your hero ability, and I think you will kill minions with your hero ability because minions are much more common than side schemes generally. Yeah, and that's the last of the cards, so let's just quickly go into conclusions here. Just go through what I actually wrote down. So, I mentioned a few times earlier on that the average cost is quite high. I'm going to turn that down a little bit. Don't know if it was too loud on the recording, but it was too loud for me. Yeah, the average cost is quite high. I actually I started tabling up the amount. I'm not going to be able to show it here because it would require me to set up a scene, and I'm not going to do that on the fly. But I was running through the numbers on the various average costs, and Wasp is now the most expensive of the ones I've looked at. Remembering I've looked at everything that came out after Rise of Red Skull so far. I also looked at Captain Marvel at one point, but never released the video, so it's in the list. But yeah, this is the most expensive. The range is about 2.33 to 2.93 now. The important thing with this is, if you started your turn in hero form and your average cost is 2.93, you only get to play one card. If it was 2.5, you'd be at 2. But at 2.93, you play one card, and then you've got 2 cards left over. And it's not like you do get a little bit from these 3, so it'll push it down a little bit, but it's not going to completely remove it once you've played the 3 cards that stay in play. So if we go 2.93 by 15, we find out that was 44 cost overall. Okay, so let's take 9 out of it and then divide by 12. So once you've got all 3 of these removed, the average cost of your hero set is still 2.92. It's high. It's expensive. It's an expensive deck to play, which means that I think which is because of all these 3s and 2s that you've got in the 4 here, and like this is the only thing that's cheap. Oh well, this and this, I guess. And she's got no resource generation outside of the tiny form pin particles. So you're gonna have issues playing your cards unless you focus on resources. You may need to focus on a lot of basic cards in order to get more resources into your deck. And also of note, this number here, the 11.33, is I think currently the lowest. No, second lowest. Captain Marvel is lower, which means that basically that just cycling your deck is not getting you a ton of value versus other characters, like say Spider-Woman, who can play pheromones twice a deck cycle. So that means that just cycling your deck is not generating you as much value as other heroes, meaning that your turn to turn needs to be better, meaning you need to rely more on your cards that stay in play and on your hero ability. And your cards that stay in play are these 3 cards here, and like this can add 1.67, and I honestly I'd probably rate this, like, Retaliate's probably the best part of this. Like, I can probably do like effectively 1 damage a turn. So we've got like 1 damage, 1 healing, and 1 fort. So grand total of like 2.33 value. Like, cool, but that's not an insane amount. Especially with a stat line that's comparable with other characters. Like 223 is not that different to, well, 223 is Captain America's stat line. It's not that different to a 222 character, and Tiny is strictly worse. Besides the piercing, right? The piercing and the ability here, and yeah. So these two all both scale off of minions and side schemes. So you've got to get minions and side schemes in order, and you can't really guarantee either of those. And oh wait, sorry, gonna quickly fix this. This was the part that I forgot about. Reliant on minions / side schemes. That probably looks awful in the video. I'm not starting again. Okay. And if I put a cut, the music will cut out weirdly. Yeah, so hero set with no resource generation or high cost, poor value per deck cycle, meaning that that 1 card you can play a turn is not, generally speaking, going to be all that great. You really need to be focusing on your hero ability. Your hero abilities are reliant on minions and side schemes. Both hero forms are, which means that she's incredibly scenario dependent. Like Red Skull and Ultron will probably be fine because you've got side schemes and you've got minions. Although maybe if you did aggression into Red Skull, you might have issues with that. Maybe. Even that's not a guarantee. Also, both your hero abilities trigger off you exhausting, which means that you're weaker to stuns, stuns confuse and exhaust. It's a bit of a problem as well. It's not as big a deal for Tiny, where you can use events instead, but it's still a problem. The flip side of all of that, though, quite literally in this case, is the alter ego ability is amazing. I think that will be what you'll long term. That'll like right now. Wasp is new. People will be playing Wasp. There's bound to be a bunch of just random decks being made for Wasp. But I think long term, the reason you'll come back to Wasp will be entirely related to your alter ego ability. That recursion is very strong. There are already a lot of good targets for it, and the hero set doesn't really show that. Like, this is probably the strongest of all the mental cards, Pinpoint Strike. Giant Help is okay. Yeah, like, these two are probably the best out of the mental cards in your hero set to constantly recur. But there are some really good targets when is the moment you start looking outside of a hero set. Like, there's a bunch of allies with mental resources. Not all of them are amazing, but these ones in particular: Nick Fury, Brawn, the Hank Pym, Ant-Man, War Machine, and Maria Hill. They all get really high values. There's also in protection, there's also Brother Voodoo, who I didn't put in here because I didn't think it was quite good enough to warrant a mention, but I'm thinking on it more, and it's probably worth it just to have a protection one there. I don't think Justice has one, or at least not one worth mentioning. Oh yeah, no, wait, it has the Justice Spider-Man. Peter Parker Spider-Man is a mental resource, and it's good, but it's more of a multiplayer thing, and it's really expensive. And you don't have any resource generation. There's no resource generation in your set. You can't. The only way to play Spider-Man is to play some of the basic cards that generate resources. I do not consider that particularly valuable. But then, if we look at other cards, Basic doesn't have any really good ones, but besides Genius is probably the best of them. But like Clear the Area, Perseverance, which is a new card from the Wasp pack that is a protection card that can give you tough status tokens when you change into a hero form. It's very strong, because you know you're going to be in hero form that turn, generally. Meaning that it basically just blocks an attack for like 1 printed cost, 2 cost overall. It's really silly. And Make the Call and Rapid Response are both mental resources, and they're both insanely powerful cards. Like, if I was to play Leadership with Wasp, I would be leaning into that, and it would basically just come down to what spread of those do I want to run. Like, do I want to go 2 and 2, or do I want to go the full 6? Or 3 and 2, or do I want to use less because I'm going to have more of them anyway? 3 Make the Calls, 1 Rapid Response is an option. It's always an option. It stops you running into the max 1 per player on Rapid Response. Regardless, all really strong and all being recurred. They're all coming for your deck more often because your alter ego action. is allowing it. The bottom of each deck cycle is just stacked. You'll be literally just looking at hands of power cards. It's really silly. And you'll have no way to play them because you have no resource generation still. So, just I'm obviously trying to hammer home this resource generation point, but it's just important to note because you can work around it using a lot of basic cards. Because basic is effectively the aspect for resource generations. So yeah, you can, like in leadership, you can start doing like Avengers Tower and team building exercise to try and pay for your allies for dirt cheap. With other aspects, you could maybe look into the enhanced cards to try and get those out. You've got your mansion, your helicarrier, your queen carrier. They're all there as options. In a multiplayer game, you could playing Wasp could end up being super greedy because you'll end up needing to steal mansions and helicarriers from other players. So if you're playing Wasp, you want to make sure that the other players are bringing those cards because you probably will need them. Like even if it's just one a turn, it'll really help. Both hero forms being reliant on minions and side schemes, multiplayer will help with that as well because there's always more encounter cards in a multiplayer game. But it's still very scenario dependent, and it's generally going to be minions, not side schemes. Red Skull's basically the exception to that. Because there's just generally more minions. And even a lot of the modular sets have minions in them. So it really helps. Overall, I should probably put it here, but overall, I actually think she's a pretty good character. Not like insanely powerful, so like she's hampered by this average cost. But I didn't mention it here, but her very good stat line, this 2-2-3 stat line, or in late game 3-2-3 stat line, and an ability that lets her, and like you get piercing and you can maintain your 2 attack in hero form, and the fact that you can trigger this off multiple times a turn using events, just all adds up. It all adds up to be to have a decent amount of value that allows you to be versatile if somewhat limited. Because you are kind of limited by your exhaust, how many times you can exhaust. But if you can increase that, which you can, so for instance, if you did like a Moxie morale boost leadership shenanigans where you're just constantly readying again using, say, Earth's Mightiest Heroes, you could allow you to use your good stat line multiple times a turn, and you're already at a pretty good baseline, and you can just get even further ahead with that. You could also do aggression focus on attacking with high value mental resource cards like Brawn is. I cannot understate how good Brawn is when you can shuffle him back into your deck. Like one of his biggest downsides is the fact that he often skips a deck cycle because of how long it takes for him to get full value. So yeah, you'll be able to just shuffle him in an extra time, and like there are other cards that are high value in aggression, like melee. Melee's not generally that great because it's just 3 and 3 damage, 6 damage overall for 4 cost. Like that's pretty good, but not like amazing. and you don't really have mental synergy in aggression, but like throw in melee in a Wasp deck, you can kill 2 minions and then do 2 damage to the villain, and all of a sudden you're doing like 8 damage with a aspect card. That's pretty good. Obviously reliant on minions, so better in multiplayer. But even if you just get like 1 minion and a hit on the villain, that's pretty good too. Anyway, yeah. Other things to consider: nearly all basic cards. If you run a bunch of basic cards, you can maximize your resource generation. I do this often with if I end up playing Doctor Strange, because there's no reason to run any aspect cards with Doctor Strange when I can do everything with his hero set. And Wasp isn't as good as Doctor Strange. I'm never going to make that claim. But you could go mostly basic cards and just like you select like a few like useful ones from your aspect. So let's say, for example, let's say you're playing aggression, you might grab 3 copies of Skilled Strike, a Brawn, and a copies of Skilled Strike, and a Combat Training. And then all of a sudden you like that may be all your aggression cards, and you just grab all the rest from basic to try and sort out your resource issues. Another thing of note: any high value mental card based combo is going to be really strong. So the best example of this would be Voltron, which is Voltron shenanigans are normally highly reliant, at least in solo, on your first aids. And if you can get, say, 5 first aids or 6 first aids or some number of first aids over 3 per deck cycle, that's very good. More first aids, and like in a Voltron style deck, first aid probably converts into like a 8 to 10 value for the cost of 2. Like that's a very strong late game. I also think that in multiplayer, defending deck could be really good, because the reason I say specifically multiplayer is I really think you want to start with Biosynthetic Wings taking your damage for you, and then swap to Giant with Rapid Growth if you can. Like that's the style that I think you would want to be in a lot of the time. And you can't really do that if you're in solo play and there's only one attack being made a turn. But solo defenseless, I think, would be pretty good, because the Biosynthetic Wings gives you 1 extra additional HP per turn, effectively. But there is the possibility of a defending deck in solo. It is harder to build them, just in general, but you do have the free defense already here, and you can effectively get free here. That means you can trigger Unflappable for extra cards. You just need to get an extra couple of defense from somewhere, like a energy barrier and a assault vest, and you should be good. Like in that case, you would probably be triggering Unflappable basically every turn, and you'd be really reliant on your tiny. You'd have to be really reliant on your tiny side, because you would need to be. You wouldn't be able to exhaust as consistently to use your hero abilities on your. To use your basic powers on your giant side. Still be able to do it, like I would probably value it in solo a lot more if Indomitable was a mental resource, but it is not. It is an energy, and thus That's why I think that it's probably better for multiplayer shenanigan. Anyway, we're gonna quickly jump across here and make sure that this is still streaming. It is. Cool. I'm gonna quickly jump across and I'm gonna. Oh wait. Let's jump across and build the deck. Tabletop sim. Okay, so first thing we'll need. Tabletop sim doesn't have a wasp in it yet. So this is the whole wasp pack. Oh. Okay, justice. Wait, it does have the wasp pack, but it doesn't have wasp? Huh. Weird. Okay, so it just has lay down the... Oh no, wait, lay down the law was the Ant-Man card. Yeah. I'm gonna build a justice deck. The reason I want to build justice was because I was playing justice earlier, and it just seems to not really work. At least not as well as I would have liked. So I'm just going to rebuild that deck and see how that goes with some additional changes. So I'm going to start with you and you. Do I use 2 copies of that. I'll need another copy of that. I have some thoughts on this card in particular, but they will be in a future video. Specifically, I want to do a deep dive on when to include the power of cards. We want 2 copies of that. We don't want the 3rd copy. We want 1 copy of Skilled Investigator, 3 copies of Clear the Area. So the reason I've gone 2 copies of Lay Down the Law is because it is a high value mental resource card that I'll be able to trigger every turn if I would like to. Because it costs 2, it thwarts for 4. That's already a... Yeah, like that's already pretty good. That's cheaper than for Justice. Clear the Area is just generally very good. I know it's the same cost, but only thwarts for 2. But the fact that you draw a card is effectively makes it a 3.1 thwart, kind of. But more importantly, Lay Down the Law is best when you're coming from Alter Ego into Hero form, so that you are always going to do that change. Whereas if you swap from Hero to Hero form, you're locking yourself into Hero form, and maybe you're locking yourself into a form you don't want. Which is why I go for more copies of Clear the Area, but just as importantly, these are both mental resource cards. I can legitimately use both. Other things I need to consider, I'm not going Swarm Tactics. It is a mental resource card, it is pretty good here. I'm not expecting to play Ant-Man in this particular deck. I think I need this one. I'm not going for War Machine. It's a cost thing for that too. Justice is not generally the cheapest deck to run. I want that, and I want that. I want Nick Fury. I want Mockingbird. I want all 3 of these double resource cards. And I want a downtime. Shutting everything down. I didn't grab those 2. Okay, I'm going to move these back up to here. I'm going to move that down to there. I just want to keep these together. That's the only reason I'm doing that. Okay, so I normally do cut these well, I don't cut Queen Carrier. Queen Carrier is very good. I normally cut the Avengers Mansion just because of the stupidly high cost, and I'm not running team building exercise, so I'm not reducing that at all. But I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But I need it to increase the amount of cards I draw per turn, such that I hit more breakpoints on the number of cards that are, such that I get closer to hitting a breakpoint on the number of basic cards that have 2 plus costs here in the Power of All of Us. It increases my effective cards in the late game by like 9%, putting me from like 11% of the amount that I would actually like, putting me to roughly 11% of the amount that I would actually like to have, instead of 20. But don't worry too much about that. Don't even worry about trying to understand that. Trying to work out what I'm talking about too much. I'm going to do a whole video on the Power of All of Us and the breakpoints and such that I aim for. I'm pretty sure that's in this deck. That should come out on the weekend. I feel like I've forgotten something. There's only 2 copies of that. I have forgotten something. Where are you? Enhanced awareness. I believe that's the deck. Okay, so you'll notice I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 cards that cost 2 plus that are basic, whereas if I look at the Justice cards, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. It makes sense that I'd use the Power in All of Us over the other. The only downside is that these 2 will stay in play, putting me down to 7, but so will 3 cards in here, this card here, as well, and downtime. So I've got 8 cards that'll stay in play, so I'm going to have 32 cards. I'm going to be going through 32 cards, and I'm only going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then these 3. So 7 cards that are cycling. The problem is all these cards stay in play for more than one, for at least 1 turn, meaning they're more likely to be drawn on the turn when you shuffle. Numbers were run, and I think this is getting me close to a reasonably valuable breakpoint, but more importantly, like it doesn't quite reach it. But I believe the reason I specifically chose only enhanced awareness and is because these ones can be shuffled in using girl to trigger to just give me more targets. But I haven't actually tested this version. I tested a previous version that wasn't working too well. But we'll get to that in the next video.